Man discovers submarine in deserted area. What he finds inside is terrifying. It was an ordinary afternoon when Rick Lawson stumbled across something that would change his life forever. He had always loved exploring, especially the untouched and remote areas around his small hometown in Nevada. The vast, open deserts provided solitude and a sense of adventure. Two things Rick sought ever since moving back after his stint in the Navy. Most days, he'd pack a lunch, take his truck, and disappear for hours, exploring abandoned mines, ghost towns, and forgotten paths. But this time, something felt different. Rick had been driving down an old, disused road deep in the desert, far beyond where most people ventured. The air was thick with heat. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering. He had veered off the main road, following a dirt trail that seemed to lead to nowhere when he spotted something unusual in the distance, a glint of metal reflecting in the harsh sunlight. At first, he thought it was just an old piece of machinery or debris from one of the many abandoned mines in the area. But as he drew closer, something about its size and shape made him slow down. It wasn't machinery. It was a submarine. Rick stared, blinking against the sunlight, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. A submarine. Out here, in the middle of the desert, he pulled his truck to a stop and got out, walking cautiously toward the massive structure. The closer he got, the more certain he became. There was no mistaking it. It was a submarine, partially buried in the sand, its rusted hull peeking out from the dunes like the forgotten bones of some great beast. The sight was surreal. Submarines belonged to the ocean, not the desert. And yet, here it was, a relic of the sea, stranded in a place where water hadn't touched the ground in millennia. Rick's heart raced as he circled the massive vessel, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The submarine was old, its steel exterior pockmarked with rust, the insignia on its side faded and nearly illegible. He could make out a few numbers and letters, but they didn't mean anything to him. What struck him most was the eerie silence that surrounded it. No wind, no birds, just the oppressive heat and the overwhelming quiet. Rick's curiosity got the better of him. He knew he should probably report this to someone, maybe the local authorities, or even the military. But something about the submarine pulled at him. He had to know what was inside. After another sweep around the perimeter, he found a hatch. The metal was hot to the touch, but after some effort, he managed to pry it open. A gust of stale, cold air rushed out, and the smell hit him immediately. Damp, like mold and decay, with a faint metallic tang. It was the smell of something long forgotten. Rick hesitated, peering into the darkness below. His instincts, honed during his years in the Navy, told him this was a bad idea. But he pushed the thought aside, grabbed a flashlight from his truck, and climbed down the ladder into the submarine's bowels. The inside was worse than he had imagined. His flashlight beam cut through the thick darkness, revealing narrow corridors lined with corroded pipes and peeling paint. The air was dense, and each step he took echoed unnervingly through the empty chambers. It was like walking through a tomb, a forgotten relic sealed off from the world for decades. Rick moved deeper into the submarine, his footsteps hesitant but steady. He had been inside submarines before, but this one felt different. Everything about it was wrong. The walls were slick with condensation. And the smell, God, the smell was almost unbearable now, like rot mixed with rust. He tried not to think about what might be causing it. As he moved forward, Rick's flashlight flickered across the walls, catching glimpses of old, faded maps and charts. Most of them were written in a language he didn't recognize. Cyrillic, he guessed, given the Cold War era feel of the vessel. Russian? Maybe? That would explain why this submarine had been lost, perhaps abandoned after some classified mission. But that didn't explain how it had ended up in the middle of a desert. He pressed on, reaching what appeared to be the control room. The equipment was old, outdated by modern standards, but still impressive in its complexity. Rick ran his hand over the rusted controls, feeling a strange sense of unease. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of metal expanding and contracting in the heat. He had the eerie feeling that he wasn't alone, though he knew that was impossible. That's when he saw it. At first, Rick thought it was just a trick of the light, his flashlight catching something at the edge of his vision. But as he stepped closer, he realized it wasn't a shadow or an illusion. There was someone, sitting in the captain's chair. The figure was slumped forward, its head hanging low, hands still gripping the armrests of the chair. Rick's pulse quickened as he moved closer, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the figure's form. It was a man, at least, what was left of him. The body was partially decomposed, his flesh dry and mummified, the uniform he wore stiff and brittle with age. Rick recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. The man had been dead for a long time, likely since the submarine had been abandoned. But there was something about the way he was sitting, like he had died in the middle of his duties, still at his post, waiting for orders that would never come. Rick took a step back, trying to steady himself. He had seen death before, during his time in the Navy, but this was different. This was eerie. Wrong. His mind raced as he scanned the room again, this time noticing the small details, the cracked glass on the control panels, the half-written logbook still open on the console. He moved closer to the logbook, flipping through the brittle pages with gloved fingers. Most of the entries were written in that same unfamiliar language, but a few words stood out. Coordinates, dates, strange references to deep-sea experiments and coded missions. And then, one entry near the end, written in shaky, hurried handwriting, sent chills down Rick's spine. We shouldn't have listened. The things we saw, they weren't meant for human eyes. The sea is hiding something ancient. We were never supposed to find it. Rick felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. What had this crew been doing? What had they found? His thoughts were interrupted by a low, metallic groan from deeper within the submarine. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The submarine, long dormant, was shifting, as if something deep inside it was waking up. Rick's first instinct was to leave, to climb back up the ladder and forget he had ever found this place. But something kept him rooted in place. That strange entry in the logbook, the eerie silence, the way the submarine had ended up here. It was all connected, and he wasn't about to leave without understanding what had really happened. Taking a deep breath, Rick moved toward the rear of the submarine, where the sound had come from. The corridor narrowed as he descended deeper into the vessel, the walls closing in on him, slick with condensation. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, he could see that the corridor ended at a large, reinforced door. It was marked with a symbol Rick didn't recognize, some kind of sigil or seal, intricate and strange. The door itself was slightly ajar, and beyond it, Rick could see what looked like a research lab. The smell was worse here, thick and nauseating, like decaying seaweed mixed with chemicals. Rick covered his mouth and nose with his shirt as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lab was small, cluttered with broken equipment and overturned tables. Glass jars filled with murky liquid were scattered across the floor, some of them cracked, their contents long since dried up. But it was the center of the room that drew Rick's attention. There, sitting in the middle of the lab, was a large, water-filled tank. The glass was fogged with condensation, but Rick could just make out the shape of something floating inside, something alive. Rick's heart raced as he approached the tank, his flashlight beam piercing through the murky water. Inside, he could see a figure, humanoid, but wrong. Its skin was pale and translucent, like that of a deep-sea creature. Long, slender limbs floated limply in the water, and its face, if it could be called that, was distorted, almost fish-like, with wide, unblinking eyes. Rick stumbled back, his mind reeling. What the hell was this thing? Some kind of deep-sea creature? Or worse, some kind of experiment? The logbook's final entry echoed in his mind. The things we saw, they weren't meant for human eyes? Suddenly, the submarine creaked again, louder this time, as if the very walls were groaning under the weight of something immense. The water in the tank began to ripple, and Rick froze. He wasn't alone. The creature's eyes flicked open. Rick's blood ran cold. The thing in the tank was watching him, its wide, glassy eyes tracking his every move. He took a step back, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. The creature shifted slightly in the water, its long limbs brushing against the sides of the tank with a sickening, wet sound. And water started to seep out, slowly at first, then faster as the cracks deepened. Rick backed away toward the door, his mind racing. He needed to get out. Now. With a sudden sharp crack, the tank shattered, and water rushed across the floor, soaking Rick's boots. The creature collapsed onto the wet metal floor with a grotesque, slithering motion, its pale limbs flailing as it struggled to orient itself. Rick didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and bolted down the corridor, his flashlight swinging wildly as he ran. The submarine creaked and groaned around him, as if the whole vessel was waking up after years of slumber. As he climbed out into the bright desert sunlight, his lungs burning from the exertion, he cast one last look at the submarine. The eerie silence returned, but Rick knew that whatever had been sleeping inside that submarine was now awake. And it wasn't meant to be found. For days after his escape, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out of that submarine. He didn't go back to the desert, didn't tell anyone what he had found. Some things, he realized, were better left undiscovered. The sea had its secrets, and now, so did he.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.